Hello, my name's Joel Williams from Kantar in the UK, and I'm going to talk to you today about how we've built a new random sample panel in the UK that we call Public Voice. So let me talk about the broad design features. The objective was to recruit a panel of about 10,000 adults defined as age 16 plus and living in standard residential accommodation across the UK. Now that's quite a large scale, so that it allows us to do some subpopulation targeting, the potential to run smaller surveys in parallel, but also single large surveys that cover the general population. Now what we expected was that we could probably get half of those to respond to any one panel survey that we do. So in other words, a greater or equal to 50% conditional cooperation rate. We do this by having a multi-mode strategy and a reasonable fieldwork period as well. So there will be an online stage of at least 2 weeks. Non-respondents would be switched to telephone alongside those that could only be surveyed by telephone. The fieldwork would last another couple of weeks. Over the online period, we'd use a multi-contact strategy. So emails, text messages, and also one letter. And we would usually offer a £10 conditional incentive, which might be an e-shopping voucher or a card version or a charity donation. And the pictures you can see on the right here show the leaflets we gave out to some respondents, or people could link to, so they could find out about the panel itself. So the idea, at least, was to have plenty of opportunity to contact them, plenty of opportunity to respond, and fair rewards for what they did. So the recruitment survey. So the idea was to have a bespoke recruitment survey of 15 to 20 minutes, so longer than some other recruitment surveys for other panels. So the objective was to get a wide coverage of multiple life dimensions, although each one covered in a fairly shallow way, of course. So our target in 2020 was to get about 10,000 onto the panel, 2,000 recruited via a face-to-face interview design, and another 8,000 recruited via a push to web design using our method, which we call ABOS, which stands for address-based online surveying. There's essentially an address sample from which people are asked to complete a survey online, but they can complete on paper instead. So that's the idea, so that the face-to-face sample would then be calibrated to official demographic statistics, although those face-to-face samples tend to be pretty well aligned with those even in the first place. Any question that used a bipolar scale or was potentially sensitive was included within a quite large self-completion module of the face-to-face questionnaire, so that in design terms we could match it up with the online presentation for those ABOS respondents. So that was a design element, but after the fact, the ABOS sample was weighted to match the calibrated face-to-face interview sample across demographic dimensions, yes, and that's completely standard, but also across behavioural dimensions and attitudinal dimensions and all the other things that were covered in that 15 to 20 minute recruitment survey. So what happened in the first recruitment survey, which was carried out in the second half of last year? Well, we got the face-to-face at the top. Response rate was about 36%, and of those 81% were willing to join our panel, which was a little higher than we anticipated. The ABOS response rates were around 7%, so an awful lot lower, but again the vast majority agreed to join the panel. And you see I've done two bars here, ABOS A and ABOS B, because there was a randomized control trial in this, in which the first group, ABOS A, was only asked to join the panel at the end of doing the recruitment survey, so they knew something about what it was like. ABOS B, people were told about it in the letter, and interestingly that had almost no impact on the response rate at all. Those who were told about it in the panel, told about the panel in the letter, were asked to confirm that they understood what they were committing to before doing the recruitment survey, but nevertheless they generally continued on. The vast majority gave us information sufficient to join the panel as well, and overall it was slightly more successful at bringing people in. What about the differences between the ABOS samples and the face-to-face samples across all those recruitment survey variables. So we here have got a distribution based on 378 point estimates across 103 variables. And you see that most of the differences are quite small. The median difference was actually only 2.2 percentage points between the ABOS response and the face-to-face interview response, but there are a few larger ones, and the largest difference of all actually 16.5 percentage points. And the samples are large enough that a lot of the differences meet the thresholds of statistical significance. Nevertheless, obviously, the fact that the ABOS sample is not clustered except by household means its statistical value in a dataset quite high before we start doing any additional weighting. And in fact, it was about 1.5 times more valuable than each face-to-face interview response on that basis. But we treat the face-to-face interview as certainly once it's been calibrated, as some sort of replication of the truth. So we want the ABOS sample to really look like that before we do any panel surveys on top. We did this approach, and this is what we ended up with. So the median difference has dropped to 1.2 percentage points, but also there are hardly any outliers. So the biggest difference between the two is 6.3 percentage points. In doing so, that weighting is quite strong. So the statistical value of the ABOS cases is reduced relative to the face-to-face cases. And in general, looking across all the variables, the value of an ABOS respondent is about 3/4 of that of a face-to-face respondent. And of course, they were much less costly to recruit. So it might be interesting just to stop for a moment and say, well, what difference, in what ways were the face-to-face and ABOS samples different? The face-to-face samples certainly more likely to say that they walk at least 20 minutes every day, that they socialize every day, and that they want to reduce taxes. The ABOS sample was much more likely to have a degree, to read or watch the BBC News, to own their own home outright, to prioritise tackling climate change as a government priority, and also to use email regularly. There's still a question, of course, about whether there are actually some measurement or mode effects despite the way we've designed this. So, of course, as I mentioned earlier, any question using a Likert scale or one that was potentially sensitive was included within the self-completion section of the face-to-face questionnaire. So we hope that the 3 modes provoke similar cognitive processes. But of course, there's a residual risk that mode effects have been treated by us as selection effects, and the ABOS data is over-calibrated in some way. So one thing we are hoping to do is to repeat some of the recruitment survey questions in some of our panel surveys. So using a uniform mode for the repeat question should help distinguish selection from mode effects in the recruitment survey. And to an extent, we were able to do this with our very first panel survey, where we asked some questions about walking and sport, and we'd also ask questions about walking and sport in the recruitment survey. They're not the same questions, but they give some indication of the potential. So here is shows you the correlation between the recruitment survey questions on walking and the first panel survey questions about walking. You see the correlation itself was quite low, so obviously those questions were not perfectly aligned, but you can also see that the correlation is about the same for all of the modes. So in this case, it's unlikely that there's a mode effect, a measurement effect in the recruitment survey, at least on this particular topic. And here's the equivalent for questions about sport. Again, the correlations are pretty similar, although there may be some hint of a mode effect between the paper questionnaire and the online or face-to-face on the other hand. So what about the recruitment survey respondents? Well, the first thing to look at is actually look at the range of contact methods that we're able to use with these panelists. And you can see that those that that were sampled for the ABOS survey and then completed online, more than half of those provided enough information for us to email them, text them, telephone call them, as well as write to them by letter. But the paper respondents were much less likely to give us all of that information, and they were more likely to miss out one or more, even though really their chances of saying yes, I'll take part in the panel was not much different from the online respondents, and the face-to-face respondents are somewhere between the two. And this is important because actually have a look at the conversion rate of the very first panel survey, though this is in fact typical of all the 4 or 5 surveys that we've run, is that firstly you can see that the majority do take part, 60% of those issued took part, but that if they didn't provide any information apart from their name to allow us to contact them, they were very unlikely to take part in the survey. If they provided all the information we needed, their chances of taking part were more like 70%. And if they missed out 1 or 2 of those pieces of information, it was more like 50%. Still good, but there's obviously a difference there. But it's a clear indicator that if they don't give you anything more than a name, they're very unlikely to actually take part, even if they agreed to take part at the time. There's also potential for longitudinal data with the public voice panel, not just snapshot data. That was certainly our hypothesis. We assume that we get low churn because limited volume of studies, members are not overwhelmed as they sometimes are in standard online panels. There are multiple communication channels for invitation, plenty of time for field work and fair rewards. So the graph on the right hand side shows how the respondents and non-respondents kind of percolated out across the first 4 surveys. So you can see in survey 2, most of those who responded at survey 1 also responded at survey 2, and a chunk of those who didn't respond at survey 1 also responded at survey 2. And you can kind of keep going down through to survey 4. And in fact, if they completed survey 1, there was a 2 in 3 chance that they completed all 4 of the surveys, and a 4 in 5 chance that they completed at least 3 of the 4. So there's certainly a potential for longitudinal data there. It's also interesting that if you actually squidge up all the blue bits together, you'd see that there was actually no net attrition over these 4 surveys, although spread out over the course of 8 months, which is somewhat better than we hypothesized. So what about the future? Well, there's a number of questions to answer over the next phase. Firstly, will the panel survey conversion rates hold at this 0 net attrition that we've seen so far? Or will they slowly slide, as have been seen for other similar panels elsewhere? Secondly, are there elements in the survey process that we do, but they don't materially improve the respondent profile or the numbers that we get and might be safely eliminated? Thirdly, is an omnibus model in which multiple clients use the same survey vehicle actually feasible, given the tailored nature of most social research? Fourth, how do we fairly price short surveys to reflect both what the client gets, a lot less than a long survey, and the costs we incur, not much less than a long survey? Fifth, how is it best to screen the panel for hidden populations prior to a targeted survey? If you're incentivizing every survey, it's difficult to just screen the whole thing and then only pay incentives to those that pass the screen. So how should we do that best? Number 6, how well can the survey response profile be manipulated through varying within panel sampling fractions? So we know, for instance, there's certain groups of people who tend to get large weights when the final panel weights are produced. We should sample those at a greater rate than those that tend to get small weights, and in that way make the survey samples more representative. 7, should the panel be used for qualitative as well as quantitative research? My colleagues are very keen on this, but of course it means passing some contact data outside of the organisation at times and treating them in a completely different way, and potentially providing them with an awful lot of information about particular topics, which means a risk of panel conditioning further down the line. Number 8, and last, how safe is it to request essentially non-questionnaire data, so GPS or web activity log data, so passive data collection? Quite common in commercial panels. Is it safe to do that without turning people off in a randomly selected panel? The usefulness of this data is another matter that I won't cover here right now. But these are all the questions for us for the future of public voice. Thank you very much for listening. free to contact me for more information. I've got my email address on the screen there. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.